why difficulty is not necessarily accessibility, and what to do about it. So first I want to kind of give a couple disclaimers about what my intents are with this presentation so that, if things are taken out of context or whatever, people know where I'm coming from, right? So I want to make very clear that this presentation is not intended to dismiss discussion on gaming accessibility. If anything, it's intended to do the exact opposite. It's trying to open up discourses within the subject of gaming accessibility to better understand the way that difficulty interacts with accessibility and disabled gaming and just, game design in general. This presentation is not intended to dismiss the needs of disabled people or attempting to classify needs as actually needed. So I want to make very clear that this presentation is not saying that we are trying to reclassify what difficulty counts as, right? Instead, we're trying to break apart and deconstruct what, difficulty and accessibility and things like that are, seeing how they interact with each other and seeing how we can rearrange these subjects into something new and understand this subject from a completely new angle, right? Saying that people asking for better accessibility are wrong or bad or violating artistic vision. I'm just gonna be blunt. People who say that, any sort of critique or criticism is violating someone's artistic vision or their identity or, whatever their intent is pretty pretentious, right? Because I think these people forget that, what we generally consider as art in, just a general casual sense, right, is not only subject to criticism, but is subject to intense criticism all the time. I mean, art is constantly subject to criticism, right? So I think it's completely fair to analyze, what I personally think works and what doesn't work, and what kind of game design choices and things like that can we gain from this. And this is intended as a serious analysis to understand these problems, not so that we can just beat up on some game, but so that we can better understand how to develop games, for ourselves, or how to, know what kind of, analyze our game experiences from a kind of more conscious and intentional lens, right? Instead of saying oh, I like this game, instead thinking well, isn't it interesting how the game interacts with the player in this way, right? I just feel that people who say that it's for artistic vision are deflecting actual criticism that any piece of actual, what most people would consider art would be subject to. So it's silly, it's pretentious, it's wrong, right? I know some people watching the audience will be like, you technically can't say that it's wrong. Okay, technically I can't say that it's universally wrong, but it is wrong from my subjectivity, which is constructed upon a set of, rules and ideas. And it is wrong to deflect criticism by saying it's artistic vision. Sorry for that deflection, but I had to say that. Saying that people who think that accessibility is related to difficulty are bad, stupid, or unreasonable people. I had to correct some people within my own Discord server, which is generally a very disabled-friendly space, on why, it's not these angry game reviewers trying to be assholes or whatever stupid BS people believe. It's actually absurd what some people believe about video games. It's I forget that gamers have the craziest takes on shit, and I'm just what the fuck? But yeah. These people are not being assholes because they said that difficulty is an accessibility thing, right? That it's a part of accessibility, that we should contextualize accessibility in this wider context that includes, things like difficulty, right? That's not why it's bad or wrong, and they were completely okay to say that. The fact that they condense their concerns into difficulty is just a natural consequence of the conditions that they were subject to, produce this answer to. I just think that, extending it beyond just, their personal experience with the game and not doing a deeper analysis of the question is really where the problem lies. And that's what we're going to try to, somewhat correct today. I think that my analysis is incomplete, but I'm really excited to see what other people might say. Telling you how you should build games. We are not telling you how you should build your games. In fact, I am very opposed to like a essentialist structural way of building games. I don't think that there is a right or wrong way to build a game, because there's always ways to surprise people. However, I do think that there is a way to consciously think about how you're designing your game, right? Like, yes, you can make a random weird game that just happens to be popular and fun, but I think that a lot of the really good games were designed that way on purpose. Like, when I think of Hideo Kojima, I don't think of a guy who's just flinging things together, okay? Like, yeah, Pokemon got lucky, but you know, most games that are good have conscious design choices that really pull them together. And I think that analyzing that can make us make better games. It's not that it's wrong to design your games the way that you do, but there's ways that you can improve upon it. There's ways that I can improve upon my game design. Every single time I work on a new little indie project here and there, I learn new ways to, you know, design games, and we're always learning and we're always improving. So, but what this presentation is discussing how to handle difficulty and accessibility in video games as a subject of analysis. And I use quite a, you know, serious kind of analysis, and I'm going to explain the approach that I use for this analysis, you know, in the next slides. And the reason why is because accessibility and difficulty are subjects that, you know, deserve to have, you know, more serious analysis put into them, because at the end of the day, especially accessibility, they have things that go beyond just like the way that we understand video games. And so analyzing how they interact with video games, you know, opens up new potentials outside of them. It's not just for fun. It's not just for casual, right? Demonstrating issues with understanding difficulty as an accessibility issue. Basically, I want to show that when you associate difficulty with accessibility as like, we should make games less difficult, because of accessibility, there are consequences that come from that, and it's maybe not necessarily the best way to discuss the problem. Trying to develop a more robust way of thinking of issues with user experience in video games. So instead of like saying things like, oh, it's my artistic vision, I think there's like real ways that we can analyze how we build video games. And again, the intention is not to establish this is how we should build video games, but rather establish a method of evolving ways of analyzing video games to produce new things and things that are, you know, enjoyable, instead of like, you know, just producing these pretentious, you know, design choices because you can, consciously thinking about what the relationship between you and the player is, and really expanding upon it beyond just like an idealistic point of view. And finally, working towards resolving concerns on both sides of disabled users and game developers. So basically, instead of like picking a side and saying like, oh no, we should make games easy all the time for disabled players, versus like, oh, we should make games like, you know, just like not usable for disabled players, because fuck these people. Like, neither of those sides. No, and by the way, most disabled people are not that extreme about their position. In fact, I think that most disabled people watching this will agree more with what I present in this presentation, but we're not picking sides here. We're trying to produce solutions. We're trying to figure out how to resolve this conflict. So, I also want to go over how problems in this presentation are analyzed. I use a particular approach that is called schizoanalysis, that is inspired by the works of specifically Félix-Guattari. Now, to be clear, there's a slightly different formulation of this idea, you know, synthesized with him and another guy. But we're not talking about that one. We're talking about the one that he specifically, you know, elaborates on in his own writing, right? And the reason why I'm using this work is because I think it's actually really insightful on how to analyze user interface and machine interactions, because I believe at its core, it's trying to understand the relationship between interfaces and the surface of communication between, two machines, basically. And not just two machines, but, like, many machines. Technically infinite machines, but we're not gonna get into that right now. Anyways, so we'll just go over essentially the way I'm constructing this analysis based off of his ideas, right? So, video games, reviews, game studios, players, and anything else relating to video games and the subject of video games are all machines that interact with each other in many ways to produce the subject of the video game itself across its surfaces, right? So, like, everyone knows that, let's take Dark Souls, for example. Dark Souls is not just literally the code in the video game. There's also the characters, there's the lore, there's the servers that some of the code is running on, there's the IP, there's the fandom, there's interpretations of events, there's all sorts of different things that actually construct the surface of what we call Dark Souls, right? And basically, all of those things are working together to produce what Dark Souls is, right? And that includes any sort of introspective analysis on what Dark Souls is. That's also part of the production of what Dark Souls is, right? But basically, all these machines are coming together and they're making Dark Souls, right? Now, problems emerge at specific junctions between these machines where they intersect, right? So I think a really good and classic example of this would just be that, let's say that this video game comes out, like a physical video game comes out, and players play it, and they don't know how to play the game. Like, let's say it's Bubsy 3D for this example. I'm not saying that Dark Souls is Bubsy 3D. I'm watching you. I'm not saying that, but Bubsy 3D is really bad to play, and so these problems are subjects themselves, and they're emerging, right, at the junction of these machines where they intersect, specifically like things like the video game itself, the player, but also the player's hands, where they put their hands on the controller itself, the literal, like, input delay that may exist between the controller and the PlayStation, memory in the PlayStation, how it handles, its game cycles and what FPS that it's consistently playing at and things like that, right? Just all of these things come together at this junction to make the game shit, right? So, to understand the problem, we must analyze the intersections of many machines at the same time, at these problematic junctions, to understand what they do and how they function. Now, this is something that he calls transversality, and I am not getting into the details of transversality here, but I just wanted to make clear that's where I'm getting this idea from. How problems in this presentation are analyzed continued. We can use a model to represent the way things are analyzed and arranged at this junction. So, like, yeah, okay, so when we describe something, that's not going to be a perfect example of what the thing is. But the thing is that description is emerging from the same productive forces that also produce the whole entire video game and also produce the problem itself, right? So this analysis is useful in understanding what the problem is, because it's, well, part of the problem in some sense, right? And we can use this analysis to break apart these things, right, and basically make subjects in of themselves, right? And we can analyze what these things do and how they interact, and we can project what rearranging these things can do and what possibilities we could potentially make by rearranging them, right? The goal is to make these machines arranged in a better way so that they can produce the solution to the problem instead. So instead of the game, having all of these problems that meet at the junction of the controller and all these fucking things that I don't want to go over again, we could rearrange how those things interact at that junction, and then they produce something different. Maybe an enjoyable game experience. Whoa. Hard to believe, I know. Can you imagine an enjoyable Bubsy 3D? That new Bubsy game looks pretty hot, but I haven't checked any of the updates, so I don't know. I hope it's good. Anyways, this way we can solve the problem by producing a new arrangement of junctions. Iterating this process can produce whole new possibilities for everyone, right? So by doing this kind of analysis, we're not just analyzing Dark Souls and saying, haha, this is why Dark Souls is bad, haha, you're a bunch of dummies. We're saying, hey, this is why Dark Souls maybe doesn't work in this one way, and we can think about this and what it's making to make a whole new game experience. Let's understand the problem. Video games are typically developed with the developer's vision in mind, right? So this is like a very restrictive kind of view, right? Like the developer knows exactly what they want to make, and they basically try to reproduce it as much as possible in the game engine. And maybe they don't know exactly what they want to make, and things just kind of happen, but either way, the developer really tries to concentrate like their vision in some way or another. They put in boundaries to make very clear what is and what is not the game they are trying to create, right? Some people may not be able to complete the game based on playing strictly the developer's vision. So like a common one, for example, that is outside of accessibility is, you know, maybe you make a controller-based game that can only be played with a controller, and the person only has a keyboard and mouse, and they can't complete the game because you can't rebind the controls onto the keyboard. Yeah, that's a problem, right? And a lot of these problems, you know, can actually meet at the junction of the video game and specific kind of players. Adaptive features that are developed specifically for disabled people are called accessibility features. Note, accessibility can also refer to unusual use cases, such as high noise or working with thick gloves, but this usually doesn't apply with most video games. This is more like a concern in like things like the logistics industry, where you might be in like a loud warehouse surrounded by trucks and machinery, and you need to still read what like an app or something says. So that's also an accessibility use case, but you're not going to probably see that with your video game. So primarily it's disabled people. Mods can be used to fix this, but it is better if the game can easily do it already, and this is because the user doesn't have to install extra stuff to make things work. And mods can also make the game more unstable, so you gotta keep that kind of stuff in mind. Let's understand the problem continued. Some games are extremely hard by design, or are not intended to be completed except by the best players. Like, the point of some games is to not be completed by most people. I think, like, a really good example of this is just, like, a ton of the really hard NES games. I understand they were produced as largely as part of a way to extend their value, because, like, oh, you can't beat the game, right? It's so hard. But, like, a part of it, too, was also intended to essentially restrict most players from being able to complete the game. Game reviewers with disabilities point out that they cannot complete such games, and so the difficulty options should be offered as an accessibility option. This is the stance held by the majority of the professional gaming accessibility community, at least in 2019. I didn't check if this is still held by 2025. I think some people are actually, like, starting to question it. But, if you still hold this opinion, it's probably not a good one, and we'll go over why. Let's go over this diagram of the problem, and this is why I have the mouse visible, so I can go over this, right? So, we have right here, this is the continued gameplay loop, right? This is just the loop going back and forth and you continuing to progress through the game until you complete it, right? However, there is a problem, right? We can't connect directly to the game reviewer because there are these barriers to continued gameplay in the way, right? So in like a perfect scenario, there would be no barriers here. It would just be this loop between the continued gameplay and the game reviewer, and they'd be able to just do the whole game, right? But there are barriers to continue gameplay that are in the way that might make it so that they can't continue the game and the game is too difficult and they have to leave, right? So the problem is that this thing right here, right, actually has multiple reasons that can produce barriers to continued gameplay, right? Now, these issues can be related to human interface failures, like accessibility failures, or more general user interface failures, but they can also be issues related to the design of the game, right? Like, a game developer can make a game that's intentionally really hard and is intended as a barrier to continued gameplay for many users. The player fails to complete the game for reasons that feel outside of their control due to barriers. The circuit between the player and the game fails. So basically, they are not able to complete the game because of barriers to continued gameplay. But the problem is that the game reviewer can't necessarily distinguish between issues that are related to human interface failures and issues that are related to intentional design of the game, because it's ambiguous once it becomes a barrier, right? It's just, I can't play the game, right? How did game accessibility professionals solve this problem? Difficulty was identified as a core problem in a really hard game, Sekiro. This was back in 2019, right? Because this difficulty interfered with the player's disability, it was considered an accessibility failure. If difficulty is considered an accessibility design, the circuit is fixed and completed, and now disabled players can play the game, in theory. There's just one issue. There is a multiplicity of machines interacting at this junction. Remember what I said earlier? What do you mean by multiplicity? Well, multiple things are happening at the junctions of subjects, like difficulty, accessibility, disability, and experience. Let's take a little time to analyze some of these junctions. This analysis is not complete by any means. I recommend you think for yourself about how these ideas can be expanded. There's so many ways you can analyze this. This is literally just the tip of the iceberg. What kinds of functions can occur at different intersections? Difficulty and at the junction of difficulty and accessibility, what we see is it makes difficulty sound like a problem for disabled or other disadvantaged users. It basically makes it sound like disabled users can't do something because of difficulty, right? That has a lot of problematic consequences, which we'll go over later, right? It focuses accessibility discourse on difficulty. Something that I thought was really interesting in the responses to my last video was that a lot of people were reporting to me just how many times in video games that, accessibility was treated as a difficulty slider, and that is not appropriate, right? I understand that some people have been trying to clarify that, but I think that just kind of like associating difficulty with accessibility encourages this kind of, design, and we'll go over why this happens in a few slides, right? Difficulty being intersected with experience, right? Associates difficulty with it being essential to understanding the experience of the game. And we all know this is not true because we can just watch the game on YouTube. Like, we can watch somebody else playing it if we really want to understand a good part of the experience, right? In the Souls games, for example, there's this whole aspect to the lore and the character design and the visuals that can be totally experienced without even playing the game, so not even experiencing the game's difficulty. So, yeah. Different difficulty levels may interfere with the core design principles of the game. For example, again, a lot of the Soulsborne games, even though some of them do have like minor difficulty, like sliders and design things as like kind of like an experimental intersection between the concepts of difficulty and narrative design. I feel like, a big part of those games is having a very high start to their difficulty curve. Like, you hit it and it's like a wall, right? Like, if you're a casual gamer, a lot of these games are going to be way too tough for you, right? That's kind of like the core design principle of those games, right? So, let's also intersect disability with experience. The experience of disabled people is supposedly too different to be consolidated into a single game's vision. Oh my gosh, how is a blind person supposed to understand my game, possibly? Oh my god. And I'm just gonna tell you this right now, if you actually believe this, blind people will fucking figure out a way. With a will, there's a way. They will find a way. I'm telling you based on personal experience, these are people who literally memorized the exact button presses to get through Pokemon Platinum, and you've never heard of it because people just don't talk about it, okay? And they did this in, like, what, 2009, 2010? God, it was early. I don't remember on the top of my head. I'm sure there's, like, a thread about it somewhere on GameFAQs, but yeah, basically, you know, blind people will take that as a challenge, and they'll try to fuck you up, and they'll try to prove you wrong. So yeah, don't be that guy. Why would disabled people want to experience something they can't access anyway? Because that's a circular argument, because you don't even know what's possible. Maybe the disabled person has a few design choices that, if implemented into your game, would make the game completely accessible, and now your game is not only playable by somebody who's disabled, but can now be experienced and interacted with and interpreted by somebody who's disabled, which expands the possibilities of what could potentially come out of understanding the game. Like, you're basically just closing opportunities to analyze your game from new people because you feel like they can't do it because you designed it that way, and we're trying to not design it that way. See how that's a problem? Yeah. Difficulty intersected with disability. Disabled people can't do difficult things. I'm gonna be blunt with you, this is pretty much the most awful bad thing about this kind of association. It's really prolific. It's how much this idea spread after, you know, the Sekiro drama took off. Like, people really believed that disabled people were saying that we can't do difficult things, and that is simply not true. And I know that some very talented disabled gamers were used as tokens in this argument, in this stupid Sekiro thing, but ultimately most gamers seem to have this impression that disabled people can't do difficult things, they can't play difficult games, and there's maybe like one or two people who can, but they're just like they're like special outliers. They're not like, you know, it's not something for disabled people. They just want dummy games, and that really is just the absolute worst outcome that came from this, and it sucks. It sucks. It reinforces the identity of disabled people based on ability rather than based on body differences and needs, right? Like, disabled people, you know, should not be, like, compared to the subject of a worker or a gamer or whatever. They should be understood more so as, how does their interface, like their body, have issues with the human interface that we designed? Like, maybe they have motor issues and the game is too fast for them to put in inputs and things like that. These are just examples. This is not a comprehensive analysis, but it gives us a good way to analyze why it was a mistake to say that difficulty sliders are an accessibility feature. We can now observe what is actually produced at these junctions. What problems are produced by saying that difficulty is accessibility? First, we're reinforcing negative stereotypes about disability. We're focusing on the inability to do things rather than the more complex human interface issues. Like, yeah, okay, a disabled person can't do something, but that's not because they can't inherently do something. It's not because of the difficulty of the situation. It's because there is some kind of barrier that is like a material barrier that can be analyzed, is in the way, and we can make the decision whether or not it's actually possible to remove that barrier. Makes non-disabled people think accessibility is about difficulty and not more specific barriers. This is a huge problem in the indie scene because a lot of indie game developers just seem to just think that having a difficulty slider is an adequate, you know, accessibility solution, and it's really not. It's really not. Like, if you don't have like bare minimum basic things like, you know, reducing particle effects or disabling shaders or having, you know, things like that, like, just, you know, maybe avoid advertising your game as accessible, because it's really frustrating to have a game claim that it's accessible and then me not being able to play it again. Many ableist comments in the gaming industry are based on this false assumption. Like, okay, I'll be honest with you, I'm a boomer, I probably can't play these really hard games, but I know it's because I'm a boomer, and it's not because I'm, disabled, but it's the very fact that I'm not. It's not because I'm disabled that this is a problem. Like, there's so many ableist gaming professionals that seem to think that it's okay to lecture disabled people about difficulty because of this whole stupid discussion, and I'm just here to say that's a bunch of bullshit. Please share this, by the way, with these professionals so that they understand that this is not a universally held opinion and that the situation is actually a lot more complicated. And I think that professionals may even find my analysis maybe even useful for their own work. So, anyways, difficulty is a vague metric. What does difficulty mean? I mean, Dark Souls seems to believe that difficulty is literally a slider that correlates with how much damage that enemies cause, from at least what I've heard. That's not difficulty, right? Difficulty can range from things like the placement of monsters, their behavior, all sorts of things, which we have to understand that a lot of those things can add on significant development time, right? So, in order to actually properly analyze what kind of changes can adequately be made to make a game more disabled accessible, difficulty actually does not provide a lot of value in of itself to the developer. It may provide value in specific contexts, but generally it's not a useful metric. How can a game developer respond appropriately to the complaint of a game being too difficult? I mean, seriously, it's probably one of the most difficult complaints to respond to, because a lot of game developers will develop the base game in the assumption, like, this is kind of how I expect people to play the game. So when that's too difficult, it's like, well, what do I do? It's kind of hard to actually conceive, how I can make the game easier in some circumstances. It's much more useful to identify specific issues rather than say a video game is too difficult. Accessibility can be adapted to specific UI cases instead. So basically what I'm saying here is that instead of saying something is too difficult, pointing out pain points and ridiculous situations that you find incredibly unfair or, unjustified in game design, that's what you should be focusing on. You shouldn't be focusing on saying, oh, this is too hard, right? Because too hard is too vague. So, more problems with this continued. Difficulty should be an allowed form of expression from the developer. There's nothing inherently wrong with trying to make a difficult game, right? And just because a lot of games in the 80s were difficult as a consequence of the development pressures of the time, doesn't mean that it's a wrong design choice to emulate that either as a statement or maybe as a challenge. It's not wrong to make a game that's really fucking hard. There's nothing wrong with that. Games do not need to be completed by everyone to be accessible. Some games are intentionally designed to not be completed by everyone. Accessibility issues concentrate around specific interactions in the game that interfere with engaging with the main game loop, not necessarily completion. So basically what I mean by this is that accessibility issues usually have way more to do with being unable to complete either an essential task or, maybe a particular cutscene or something like that than it does with just the fact of being able to complete the game. Very difficult games belong in accessibility discourse without being negatively moralized. If anything, I see it as a challenge. We should be making difficult games as accessible as possible, because think about how fucking cool it would be to see some severely disabled person complete a super hard as fuck game. It's always super cool. Come on. Let's take a moment to debunk some gamer myths before we continue. Are the reviewers bad people? No! I can't believe I have to explain this, but I gotta go over this. Game accessibility reviewers have limited access to a game and less time to review accessibility concerns, unlike a consultant hired by a company. No access to QA features that would distinguish the problematic game components without difficulty being its own barrier. I mean, they're basically playing the game like you are, except with, privileged access and stuff, but they don't get to, go to different levels and be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. That's actually not too bad. They just have to play the game like you do, and if there's a big barrier that doesn't let them finish, then they're like, yeah, I can't finish the game. Even if they had access to QA features, it's unfair to expect them to independently identify all issues that cause this difficulty. I'm just going to say this as a disabled person, it's very hard to actually identify what causes a problem if it's not already documented, right? It requires like actual significant research and development to really understand these issues, and it's actually, you know, really possible to jump the gun and actually be like, hey, I think I solved this problem without like doing enough research into it. And I think that, you know, this whole problem emerged partially because people were moving a bit too fast with trying to understand what the extensive accessibility possibly were. You know, like, it's not like evil or wrong or horrible, it's just a consequence of not fully being able to describe the problem. Like, imagine being me for a second, and for 15 years you literally cannot identify what causes most games, especially pretty much produced ever since 2008, 2009, to make me just feel horribly sick, right? A game basically has to be designed like as if it was made before that period, or else I'm gonna feel really freaking sick. I don't know what necessarily causes it. In my opinion, I actually think it would be really cool if the problem could be identified more specifically, but right now I really don't know what the exact problem is, and as a result, I feel like the best way to make games more accessible for me is to reduce the fidelity of the graphics and also have a more consistent frame rate. And also reduce things like particle effects and things like that. Basically reduce motion, reduce all the crap, alright? But, yeah, basically, it's just a frontier that is not really fully explored, and it's not their fault for not fully exploring it in the span of, like, a few fucking weeks. It is likely the reason why the game can't be completed is unable to be reliably identified in this time frame. It is not appropriate to harass a reviewer on why they could not finish a specific game. Gamers, I'm serious. People do, like, you need to understand how people outside of, like, your little sphere see your dumbass behavior. Like, this is, yeah, like, okay, people made mistakes, but this is, like, really dumb. There are likely many reasons outside of their control, including possible unidentified accessibility failures. Like, they literally didn't have the resources to be able to make a fair judgment. Most people don't finish games. They should be allowed to offer feedback regardless. Like, yeah, most people don't finish games. Do you really think that most people who don't finish or complete the majority of the game are not allowed to have an opinion? That's so pretentious. Like, I guess that means we have to play through every shitty game in order to have an opinion on it, right? You've played through every single shitty game 100%, right? Right? Alright, just to make sure that it doesn't get really good at the end, right? Yeah, okay. Shut up. It's much more useful to get a wide range of feedback rather than just listening to a favored subset of responses. Like, yes, okay, listening to your fans is important. I'm not saying that you shouldn't listen to your fans, but you should also listen to people who are not your fans, because they give you a lot of valuable insight into how your project is seen by people who are not already into your shit, right? So, like, they can help you identify pinch points for people who may want to engage with your work. So, it's good to pay attention to those people. Is analyzing difficulty with regards to disability usability wrong? No! Understanding how disabled users interact with game design is a complicated subject, more complicated than just accessibility standards. Like, yes, you can follow all of the accessibility standards, but that's not going to necessarily make your game accessible. You actually need to work with a person who's disabled to really know for sure, right? But you can offer features that can help the experience for many people. Accessibility standards can help achieve usability for disabled pictures, but it's not necessarily the whole picture. Real accessibility does not exist, and this concept is harmful. I'm a little bit upset by how a few people in the comments of my last video seem to think that the problem with difficulty was that it was not real accessibility. There's no such thing as real accessibility. It's not a binary thing. Like, shut up. Instead of identifying real accessibility, focus should be on solving tangible problems identified by disabled users. Like, if a disabled user says, hey, I think this problem is making it really hard. Can you add a feature? Like, you can say yes or no to that, but, like, you know, that's a real problem. That's what we should be focusing on. We shouldn't be focusing on, like, theoreticals and abstractions that don't actually reflect what a disabled person needs. The problem was associating difficulty with disability and providing a vague answer to a complex problem that really needed more thorough analysis. I just realized I kind of sound like Tails. Is creating a video game too difficult for disabled players wrong? No! If accessibility possibilities were fairly offered and the game's difficulty is intentional, we should not say that this is necessarily a failure of accessibility. The game is working as intended. Some disabled players will try to demonstrate the game can be completed by disabled players. These players are actually very valuable because they can offer some really important feedback on accessibility barriers that they experienced and can demonstrate that the game is completable by disabled players. Basically, their feedback can make your game just easier to play in terms of the human interface element, not the difficulty element, if that makes sense. It is okay to make games that are not finished by everyone. It is okay to make games that are difficult. Analyzing difficulty without it being an accessibility standard is useful for analyzing game design in more general contexts. The design of Soulsborne's difficulty philosophy is, in my opinion at least, inherently wrong, but not because of inaccessibility. It's wrong because it makes it difficult for most new players to learn how to overcome the challenges of the game, which includes disabled players too. And we'll go over this later, but yeah, basically the fundamental problem with the Soulsborne series is that it uses difficulty as such an intense barrier that it blocks out a lot of people from enjoying the game. Unfortunately, this entire discourse has serious consequences for how accessibility was understood by the wider public. Let's produce a machine that changes how these ideas are organized and see if we can make something that could produce a new solution. First, let's analyze what some of these other machines are producing and structure their relations a little bit better. What is the professional opinion of accessibility in gaming? Many accessibility game professionals will say that accessibility is allowing as many people as possible to play the game. They view that as many people playing the game is an important way to increase market share. There are some issues with this definition, however. Some games are intentionally designed to be only played or completed by a few players. Games are best when they appeal to the right people, instead of all people or as many people as possible. Like, seriously, think about your favorite game for a second, and think about the kind of people who play that game. They probably have a specific set of, interests and things like that that make the game appeal to them, as opposed to, like, a game with a wide audience, Disabled people are a subset of the right people, not the other way around. So what I mean by this is that you have the subset of people who really are interested in your game, right? And that subset is going to include disabled players. You want to make your game that this subset of people who are interested in your game, like, you want to make it playable to all those people as much as possible, not like the entire breadth of all disabled people. Many disabled people like a challenge, and it could unintentionally imply disabled people are adverse to difficult things. I've explained this a couple times. Usability issues have more to do with unnecessary barriers for the right people rather than how many people can play the game. Now, I do emphasize this whole idea of right people, but the thing is that you can't actually measure and know and poll your audience to actually know what issues are. So it's generally a good idea to preemptively predict these issues. This is the real reason why you want to implement a broad scope of accessibility features into your game, because you don't know what the right people actually need for their disability accessibility needs, right? That's the real reason why you focus on producing that game. But you focus on what your audience actually wants, which includes disabled people, right? Disabled people are not just like outsiders who want to play your game. There's disabled people who want to play your fucking game, okay? Let me get that clear. A better definition. Accessibility. Identifying edge case UI failures caused by unusual user circumstances, the most common being a disability. overcoming unintentional barriers, and improving communications in human interface edge cases. So basically, we're focusing not on the difficulty of the game, but rather improving the game's communication with the player, which can include difficulty. It's not just the keyboard or the screen. And I think like what people who are talking about this idea of difficulty as accessibility were really interested in exploring was more so the idea of accessibility being more than just like whether or not something is on a screen or has this level of access, you know, this or that or the other, right? They were thinking about what are the extents of usability, what can we potentially, you know, make as a broader thing. The real problem was, again, associating necessarily a term that almost usually always exclusively refers to disabled people with the concept of difficulty. You know, but like the core idea of trying to explore the extents of what these issues could possibly be is not inherently wrong. UI failures are focused on ability to engage with game and software loop, not necessarily completing the game. However, even if some of these UI failures may only arise only once in the story, like maybe some particular cutscene or something, they are still accessibility issues if the barrier is not intended for players and must be corrected. What I mean by not necessarily being able to complete the game is if the game is intentionally very difficult, right, and a disabled player can't complete it, even though they've been provided a, you know, essentially an entire suite of, you know, accessibility tools to be able to achieve it, you know, maybe it is just that the game is too difficult and that's okay, right? Focus on how different kinds of players flow through the game. Where are the pinch points, right? You know, a lot of times with disabled players, it's not what people think it is. It's actually, you know, I think a big one that is often neglected in the difficulty discourse is actually, you know, input models, right? And this is actually one of the more difficult things to develop. So, your game should, if your game is a modern game, it really should support key binding. It's actually not that hard to do, even for indies. I actually am thinking about like starting my game development sooner than later, just because I was going to wait until January, but I think I'm going to start developing now so I can actually like give people like tutorials and tools on how to design a lot of these elements, because I think that they're just intimidated by like how to approach the design of these ideas, right? And I'm going to give examples that can help inspire people to come up with solutions in their own games that, you know, achieve a lot of the same kind of ideas and effects. But basically, you know, you want to identify with keyboard stuff, with inputs and stuff. A lot of people don't understand that a lot of motor disabilities make it very difficult to even consistently push a button, right? That can be very difficult. It can be very difficult to hold a button down, right? And this is what I mean by we really need to focus on the human interface element of these kinds of things, right? And I want to stress that this doesn't include just physical disabilities, but the emphasis is on human interface, right? Because game developers are usually not thinking about the fact that some disabled people literally cannot hold a button down, right? So, for example, toggle buttons. So, toggling a button for basically rapid pushing down or things like that is a valuable asset for accessibility in your games because it addresses a pinch point. That is what you need to focus on. What about difficulty then? Freeing difficulty from being an accessibility usability requirement allows difficulty to be analyzed as an intentional game design choice. So instead of just saying, oh, it's something that makes certain users unable to play the game, we can actually analyze how difficulty actually interacts with users in the game. How does it, how does it bring people into the game? How does it exclude people from the game? I disagree with Soulsborne's design choice for difficulty, but why? We should think about why these design choices don't work. We have to stop we have to stop letting these people hide behind some bullshit about artistic integrity, because it's not about artistic integrity, because if it was about artistic integrity, they'd be open to criticism. It's deflection. We should actually address these issues. We need to think about what is produced when we create a very hard game. A game that's not intended to be finished by every player, and a game that excludes certain players intentionally. We need to actually think about what those things mean. What does it mean for something to be an artistic choice? Art doesn't just exist for arbitrary reasons. It has a point. People make art choices, even if they're not aware of it. They make these choices for a reason. And the thing is, it's not our goal to figure out what that reason is. I mean, analysis can be useful, but it should be useful. That's the point, right? You know, don't waste your time just analyzing shit to whip your dick out. But I mean, we can think about why people made these choices. What point is expressed when you design your game in a certain way? What does it mean for a game to have an identity or be an artistic expression? Like, seriously, I believe that most of the people who actually say this about From Software games genuinely have never thought of these, like, what these two questions actually mean, like, once in their lives. They're just saying it because they're like, oh, well, it has an identity that should be preserved. Okay, but what does that mean? What does it mean for a game to have an identity? I mean, you don't believe trans people have identities, so I'd be interested in knowing why a game has an identity, but not a trans person. I'm just shitposting there. Please don't, like... I know you're already typing something, but I'm not gonna read it. I don't care. But what are the consequences of the intersection of these ideas in designing a game that denies certain user access? We need to actually think about what it means when we say, no, you can't complete the game. That has, like, real consequences. That is an artistic choice when you do that. Dark Souls is actually interesting because it actually does have an artistic choice reasoning to make the game very hard, which is that you're escaping from hell, which is a decent choice, but I also don't think it's, like, a fully complete adequate choice. Like, I get the artistic vision, right? But it's just kind of weird that, like, I don't know, the gamers don't point that out. Like, I literally have never played a Dark Souls game because I can't. But, like, I can look at the user interface and say, wow, that's fucking ass. But, like, just, like, based on what people are saying about it, like, I just don't think that... Yeah, I just don't agree with the game design choice. And, like, I just think it's weird that people who can actually play these games and can finish them have never thought to themselves once, like, wow, what is the real reason why they made that game design choice? What are the implications of that? What does that mean? What does that tell me about the medium as a whole? Like, the whole medium is the message thing, kind of, you know, like, they've just never thought about that, and that's just crazy to me. What does difficulty design actually do? Game difficulty varies across the span of gameplay. Difficulty curves, so, like, basically how difficulty changes over the course of a game. You have difficulty modes, which are kind of like what you have in Doom, which is, like, different variations of how difficult the game can be based on, like, the user's choice. And even From Software varies difficulties within its games. I mean, somebody pointed out something about, like, an arm attachment or something being used in Sekiro to be, like, a sort of narrative, like, difficulty slider. I think it's interesting as an experimental game design choice. It is kind of a little weird that, it feels like From Software just cannot, like, hold in this, like, obsession with analyzing difficulty through their games and just associating everything with, like, this concept of difficulty through their UI. I mean, yeah, whatever. But even they are experimenting with different difficulty levels. Like, even the gamers have pointed this out. So the question is not how hard the game is, but how you gave the player the tools to overcome its difficulty. And this is something that I think is really interesting, because, like, From Software defenders seem to forget that, again, difficulty is something that varies across a game. There are difficulty curves. Even these games have difficulty curves. It's just that they start the difficulty curve very high, unlike a typical game, which would start the difficulty curve low and then work up towards a high difficulty curve, right? And this has real consequences because it means that as the player progresses through the game, they are granted a different set of tools to actually be able to overcome that difficulty curve, right? Even if we have, like, the same mechanics introduced at the same levels, having a super high difficulty curve is actually a barrier in of itself. It is actually the lack of being provided the ability to train adequately without being severely punished. I mean, like, I think, like, a decent example isn't, like, the 2020 Doom game. Doesn't, like, their highest difficulty mode make it so that it literally deletes your save file in the same way, like, how Minecraft does with hardcore? You know, like, it just makes it so you can't play it anymore, and you Like, that is a severe punishment. But, like, at the same time, the game does give you an opportunity to get the tools to learn how to play the game, which part of it is actually having an easier gameplay mode where you can get used to the controls and things like that, right? So, oftentimes, complaints on difficulty, especially early in the game, indicate not giving these tools properly to players. Like, yeah, that's kind of the whole... Yes, that's the whole game design concept with these, like, soulsborne games, but, like, it's still a problem. Like, you're basically, like, it's kind of, like, weird when you think about it. It's kind of like one of those, like, weird indie games where you're given, like, a spoon and the whole idea is to, like, traverse the whole map or whatever. Like, that's kind of what the design philosophy of Dark Souls is. And, like, again, it would be interesting to, like, you know, if they actually, like, explored this, or, like, fans, like, talked about it from more of this kind of perspective instead of just hiding behind, like, oh, it's artistic expression. Yeah, but what does that mean? It's interesting how I can, like, just... I've never even played these games before, and I feel like I'm doing more of an analysis than, like, half of these people. It's just really sad. Like, this is part of the reason why I want to open these people's brains up to it. Anyways, people will just mod your game if you think you're better than them, but they'll hate you for it. Like, seriously, if you want to refuse to, like, make a decent experience for gamers, like, yeah, they'll mod your game if they really think it's worth it, but they'll bitch about it, they'll make fun of your code, you will be the subject of ridicule, there's consequences. Just give players the tools for the job. I mean, it's really not that hard. Come on, would you want to be a warrior, work in construction, or clean a bathroom without the right tools? No, of course not. And believe me, I've had to clean bathrooms without the right tools, and I've had to clean bathrooms with the right tools, and I would clean a bathroom with the right tools any goddamn day. Perhaps the question of the relationship with these tools is not really binary. It is unreasonable to require disabled people to identify all accessibility lapses. This can actually be very hard to do, especially if the problem is not well understood or documented by others. Identifying what is real accessibility and not real accessibility is a waste of time and harmful. Looking at accessibility as a binary affair is just not useful. Stop doing it. The problem was not about how to identify accessibility failures accurately, but how language can carry unintentional meaning through association. We have to be careful about what we call things, and we have to be careful about how we analyze things, because these things have consequences when they're introduced into the wild. We should focus on what is needed to produce solutions for accessibility, not just definitions. Sometimes this is defining what is and what is not accessible as specific binarized subjects, such as standards. Other times, it is designing more general solutions that allow for greater accessibility through the game design itself. What matters is what works together to solve the problem. Accessibility deserves sophisticated design and discourse. Disability accessibility is not a moral endeavor, but rather a sophisticated and serious problem within human interface design. I mean, you guys love to fucking LARP about cyborgs, but when it actually comes to, like, writing software for cyborgs, you get really cold feet. I'm just gonna point that out. Accessibility helps us understand the relationship our bodies have with machines and media, and produces a relationship between our bodies, ethics, and aesthetics. It's literally revolutionizing the way that we see technology and human relations. Like, come on. Accessibility in gaming has the potential to produce new ways of life for disabled people outside of gaming. See, gaming does actually produce things that are used outside of gaming, usually things with, like, rendering and navigation and, you know, simulation is a big one. All of these things could be made more accessible by, you know, borrowing principles that were originally designed in games. Difficulty should not be seen as a barrier, but as a challenge, including mod developers. Developers who dismiss accessibility should be met with a response made with new machines such as mods, hacks, and decompilations. Yeah, we're coming for your code. Now with this new arrangement, let's see how we can produce solutions instead of problems. How can hard games improve its accessibility? Have disabled players provide feedback and implement their suggestions when reasonable. If you are an indie, find disabled playtesters interested in your game. If you are well-funded, hire a consultant. Don't pull this shit. If take input seriously, focus on the pinch points, not on your snide comments. Nobody's interested in your stupid, uninformed opinion. Keep it to yourself. Try to follow known accessibility guidelines. WCAG standards are a great reference. These are standards used in web accessibility, and you can learn a lot about what certain kinds of impairments can do to a web experience and transfer those skills to game accessibility design. GamingAccessibilityGuidelines.com has a good list of tips. There's a lot of useful tips here, especially with stuff that I think that game developers typically wouldn't think of on the top of their heads, like how I talked about motor accessibility, but also things like, vision and cognition and things like that. And I think that, based on what I saw, I think it's a good resource, so you should be able to use that. It's okay if you can't do everything, but doing many of these things will help a lot. Just making the gesture and actually making something usable for some people to actually, make it a better gameplay experience for some people, it does make a difference, I'm telling you. Offer mod support for your game. Focus on the ability to change inputs, outputs, and timing and things like that. A lot of people seem to think that, just allowing disabled people to add, HUD features and stuff is sufficient, but there really does need to be a lot more available, things like changing textures, maybe changing, the rendering. That can really help, have a sophisticated mod engine for your game. Mods are not ideal, but it may be the only viable option sometimes. Yeah, I don't want people to think that mods are an appropriate substitute for doing basic shit, but I understand as well that it's also impossible to necessarily scope every single possible use case scenario and edge case. So that's kind of what makes an edge case an edge case. It's something that you don't really think about. So, allowing for mods and also having a good communication with your game's mod community can really improve these very highly specialized scenarios. What if disabled people are still struggling? Oh god. Identify pain points from feedback. Focus on fixing smaller issues first. I know this sounds like a menial thing, but it's often a collection of small issues that make a lot of people struggle, as opposed to having to build a crazy new engine. I know that with blind accessibility, and I don't mean visual impairment, I mean fully blind accessible games, that this is a very difficult endeavor and does require a lot of game design know-how to actually make it work. And it does require working with blind people, on every stage of the project, to really make it kick ass. But, fixing these smaller issues is going to accommodate, most of the people complaining. Focus on those things, and then move towards the more complicated things. And then that way you can also demonstrate to your audience that you do take these things seriously and you improve them as soon as you can. Consider integrating popular accessibility mods with the creator's permission. This is part of the reason why I think it's a good idea to have, a good relationship with the mod community. I think that integrating, useful accessibility mods into the main... I'm thinking, in Git terms, move it upstream to the main, to the main project from the fork, all that crap. But basically, migrating these changes into the main game so that it's just easier for people to work with. I understand that some mod creators may not like that approach, and that's fine, but, it's just a suggestion. If you can't implement changes, be honest about it. Don't hide behind these pretentious "it's my art" arguments. It's okay to be inexperienced or lacking the labor to put in complex accessibility features. But think about what saying refusing to implement accessibility as part of your vision actually says about your vision. Especially if you have any disabled characters in your game, expect to be completely pummeled by criticism online. How can I actually improve my gameplay experience? Seriously analyze your design choices. Do not just assume it is artistic. Think about what your choices are producing. Stop defending your bad game design decisions based on it being art. Let people criticize you. Think about how designs like difficulty, lack of accessibility features, and unfriendly design lead to UI failures across many different kinds of users. Like, think about how these things actually impact your users. Like, think about what the machine that you're making is producing. The goal is not to eliminate hard or unfriendly games, but to make these things more intentional. You want to be more conscious about the decisions that you're making. Think about what message you are communicating through the medium of your game and how well you are communicating that to your audience. Now let's actually get around to analyzing the Soulsborne series and what this whole difficulty crap leads to. So what limitations to Soulsborne are introduced when we insist on hard difficulty? Contrary to popular belief, focusing so much on difficulty ignores many aspects of the game's identity. The games feature rich lore and an aesthetic attractive to many people. The rhythmic gameplay is completely off limits to casual players. See, like, casual players can still watch people playing the game and experience the aesthetic but they literally cannot play the rhythmic, gameplay because it's too hard. Like, I think there's a way to capture that aspect of the game without just it being hard. Like, that's just, I don't know, I get it. I'm not saying that it's necessarily inherently wrong, but I am saying from my perspective, I disagree with that design choice. Unique, small, and memorable game design choices are lost if players can't engage with the game without being frustrated. It's actually kind of funny that Heartbound actually did a better job with this than, Dark Souls, because even if I didn't have the migraine issues, I still wouldn't make it very far in Dark Souls, and I wouldn't be able to experience, the actual, texture of the game's narrative. Which is kind of funny, because in Heartbound, there were actually events in the game that I actually found quite memorable, such as the Shy Book. And I was able to experience that because the user interface wasn't so bad, and the difficulty wasn't so bad that I wasn't able to actually get to that point. And you're basically discluding people from actually having, that kind of experience. Many possible players who could complete the challenges are turned away too early because of hostile design. I like to call this abusive father game design, right? So what do I mean by abusive father? Well, think of an abusive father for a second, who basically thinks that to his son he can just continue to bully and harass and abuse his child until his child eventually gets so sick of his shit that he becomes better than him by leaving. Now, here's the problem with that, right? The problem with that is that the child now goes to this, freaking game, right? And is like, oh, this is just like my dad. I'm going to overcome him, and he's going to continue to beat his head against the wall until he finally figures out how to beat all the bosses and memorizes all the patterns and blah, blah, blah. Just like how he had to memorize all the patterns of the abusive father's behavior. And then at the end of the game, he is met with a similar set of, supposed freedom, right? But here's the catch. The thing is that just the abusive father is really a petty individual. I mean, he's literally bullying a child, right? This person is violently bullying a child who is a third his size for years and years, right? Until you overcome him. And think about what that implies about the design of the game itself. I mean, it doesn't just imply that it is abusive, but it also implies that it's stupid, petty, and ridiculous. And maybe part of the reason why people aren't playing it is not just because of the difficulty, but there are games that treat people better than these Soulsborne games, And, as I learned more about the game design, and I learned about, issues with how the game is implemented, and things with, just known issues, it became apparent to me that this game is, let's get real. From Software is no Chris Sawyer. And that's not a problem. I'm fans of the Pokemon games, but it's literally like an abusive father who's hiding his, insecurities behind his violence against his child. And I'll just be blunt with you, I don't want to play this stupid fucking Oedipal Freud family drama bullshit. Fuck you. No. You are not as tough as you think you are. This Oedipal bullshit is not the toughest crap in video games. Not by far. There are games that are more historically relevant with higher skill ceilings than Soulsborne games that are not above the difficulty curves. Doom is a really good example because some of the commercial levels of Doom released in TNT and Plutonia were not even completed in Ultraviolence for like over half a decade. That's a hard as balls game, but apparently, you know, they didn't believe that they were above having difficulty levels. You know? And I'm just gonna say it, anybody who actually thinks that Doom is less culturally relevant than anything that From Software made needs to, like, literally touch grass. Like, that is the most insane opinion. You will find a boomer who knows what Doom is. You will find way less boomers who know what Dark Souls is. They're probably like, oh, Dark Souls, that's the game that my grandchild plays, and he also beats women. Yeah, exactly. High-level NES Tetris play. Now, if you don't know anything about high-level NES Tetris play, this shit is absolutely fucking insane. In order to actually get past, like, the first set of, like, high levels, you have to adapt your controller to a technique that you've probably never fucking seen before in your life, and it's absolutely insane. And it's all to be able to process the inputs fast enough so that you can even play the game. It's crazy what these people are capable of. And in fact, part of what I really love about NES Tetris's challenge is that it has nothing to do with any sort of bullshit between, like, this game beating you up like an abusive father. This game is just a crazy machine that's super fucking hard. When you get to super high levels, the machine starts breaking and you are fighting against the collapse of this crazy machine. It's the coolest fucking thing ever. Seriously, if you're into Guattari and you're into video games, you gotta check out high-level NES Tetris play. It is the craziest shit you've ever seen in your life. From Software fans, I will be impressed when you can memorize the attack patterns of the CPU taking too long to calculate, the process of calculating the score timer, and thus being interrupted by the V blank state, and thus fucking up the state of the registers and crashing the game. If you can do that, then I'll take your opinion seriously. Till then, I'm gonna sleep. These games do not rely on abusive father tactics to teach their player how to get good. They give the player everything they need outside of issues caused by glitches to have them complete the challenge. Like, yes, it's true that people with motor disabilities are not going to be able to do the crazy controller shit that's necessary for high-level NES Tetris play, although it is probably possible for a machine to be built that can potentially adapt them. That would be a really interesting challenge. But, like, the thing is that it's really not that makes the challenge really difficult. That's what I'm getting at. It's okay to enjoy really badly designed games. Like, it's badly designed games can still be fun, and they have a ton of fucking charm. I absolutely fucking love Pokemon Red and Blue. I love how batshit insane these games are. I actually really don't like how people just, like, shit on these games all the time, because when you actually know more about its production history, and you know more about the history of Game Freak, you realize that, like, these guys were basically on the level of, like, an average indie game developer. They started as a gaming zine. Like, that's fascinating. And this is, like, basically Miyamoto saw that these guys were gonna maybe make something that could make money from the link cable, and he just threw money at them. And the project almost completely sank because they had no idea what they were doing. They were in over their head. They lost, developers. And it's just absolutely fascinating. Like, you gotta check it out if you don't know anything about it. It actually makes the first 2 generations of Pokemon so much more charming, knowing that these were guys who were just like, I don't know, let's talk about technology. Many great games have serious design flaws and usability issues. I mean, Red, Blue, and Yellow have a hilariously rigid menu system that was improved with quality of life features in Gold and Silver. Like, seriously, if you play those two games as they were presented when, like, the clean ROMs, oh my god, you will notice the difference. You will notice the difference. Fixing these issues only serves to improve the player experience. Like, are you going to tell me that the bizarre and clunky behavior of the menus in red, blue, and yellow are a design choice intentional by the developers? No! That's how they built it. There's ways we can improve it. It's what we choose to do with our mistakes that makes them continue being mistakes. So if you just, like, hear somebody criticizing you and you say, oh, that's just a bunch of bullshit, they're just a stupid idiot who is not good enough at my game, then you just don't change anything and there's no possibility for improvement or analysis. But when you actually do think about, like, what's going on and you want to change your behavior, that can change your mistakes into something new. Let's make machines that produce solutions.